Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ethicsverse, the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to get started here. We have an awesome show for you today with some great guests. We're going to be talking about something that is usually top of mind for everybody in compliance, whether you just started in your front line or you're already a CCO. So let's get in and do a couple intros here. So we're going to be talking about secure your seat, how you can fit in with the executive team. We're going to be talking about advocating to the board, how you can engage, how you can be more effective in that ever elusive tone at the top, getting buy-in and engagement from the board of directors and your senior leadership. So just a couple things here. Feedback's a gift. So give us a gift. If you haven't blessed anybody with a gift today, give us the gift of feedback and jump in and take the survey. All of these links are on the console, so you can get these if you don't have your phone out for the QR code, but it's there for you too if you want it. Quick little survey there. All right, so help us help you. The topic that we're doing today about board advocacy is also the subject of a survey that the button is on the console. So click on that button and take that survey and have your voice heard and be part of our 2024 survey about board advocacy here. So if you feel like, shout out to Sisyphus here, you feel like you're pushing this rock up the hill for the board, then take our survey and be the first to get the results to find out how we can better advocate to the board. As you know, we love learning. We love your work and we love learning. So check out our socials and our podcast and our books in the Ethicsverse library at ethico.com and a bunch of our friends and favorite people here. Here's a link to that. That's also in the console for you. So jump in there if you like. If you're not subscribed to the Ethicsverse, you've got to subscribe to the Ethicsverse. Only subscribers get that extra special welcome at the start of each episode, so get in there. I had this talk with Tobias Sturluson, and he is talking about how we build an effective culture and how toxic cultures, whether they're intentional or not, can lead to damage in the workplace. It was really a super engaging discussion, and as we all know, compliance is culture. So check out this episode and all the ethics experts episodes for how to build a better culture of compliance. Award-winning FCPA survival guide. It's a book and a white paper, and it's a bunch of episodes. Nick, Tom Fox, the voice of compliance. You got to check this out. It's winning awards all over the place. If you don't know, you should know that you got to engage your middle managers. A lot of companies maybe only get 1.6 reports per 100 employees per year, and employees are 6 to 8 times more likely to go to their manager. So check out our middle managers toolkit from Ethico. It's free. It's for you. It's a bunch of stuff you can just download and immediately apply and plan out and get out to your organization. A ton of actionable stuff here to help you figure out how to engage middle managers to get a bunch of leverage out of your spend in your compliance and ethics program. The ecosystem is also winning awards all over the Ethicsverse, all over even the world. So check out the ecosystem. And what we're going to be doing today is our world famous book giveaway. So managing technology and communications is a great reference for you to be a better communicator. You got to communicate to build culture. You got to have a strong culture to have a good compliance and ethics program. 5 of these coming out today. Jump in the chat, take the survey, a bunch of ways to earn points toward this. And this one you don't even have to earn. This is free from Ethico to you to help you build a better compliance program. We're giving away up to a free year of service for someone who signs up for a new service to make it easier to transition, make it easier to justify the budget, make it easier to manage the overlap of an old service to a new one. We're so confident that this is you're going to become a raving fan that we'll take the bill on ourselves for up to 1 year. So we're about to jump into the show here. I'm Gio Gallo, co-CEO of Ethico. I'm super excited to be here, and I appreciate each and every one of you showing up, jumping in the chat, slamming those emoji buttons, because, we feast off of those. I'm handed over to Angie to talk about her background, and in a couple minutes, we'll get into the discussion. Angie, over to you.
Hey, everybody. So happy to be here today, and I always love seeing all the hellos in the chats on these webcasts. My name is Angie Gorman. I am a managing director at FTI Consulting, and I have spent my career in corporate communications, and the last 25 or so of those years have been focused on internal communications, change management, and culture. And for the last 4 to 5 years, I've been focusing those efforts on clients with compliance issues and compliance challenges. And I find the work so interesting. And I love this community. I just absolutely love working with all of you because you're just, normal people trying to get a really tough job done. So, what we want to talk about today, obviously, is how you can be more effective with your board. There's been a lot of good conversation about this lately, and, we agree with a lot of what I've been hearing lately, but we also want to add some really practical tips for you on how to enhance your communication with the board. So my colleague, Evan Roberts here, has actually a lot to say about that from a related piece of work that he's done with one of your peers in information technology. So Evan, please introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Angie. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me. My name is Evan Roberts. I'm a senior managing director with FTI Consulting, and I co-lead, our cybersecurity and data privacy communications practice. So I feel like a bit of an interloper, but also Angie and I have been talking about the parallels we see between security organizations, information security groups, and the compliance function, and the challenges and opportunities that both of those groups have had to engage their boards, engage their executive teams, and in many ways collaborate, because they're both risk-based functions that, if strong communicators in place, have a real role in enabling the success of organizations as well. And so when Angie told me a little bit about this podcast and Geo and this organization, I was so excited to have the opportunity to join you all. I do a lot of things in the spectrum of cybersecurity and data privacy communications. A lot of it is in the crisis mode. But what we're going to talk about a little bit today is what else we do and we have done to help train security leaders to be true communicators as well. And I was chatting with Gio a little bit about this before we got on. And again, I just see so many parallels between compliance and information security. It's a career path where comms may be a small piece of it, and then you get thrust into a role where it's a huge part of your job. And how do you think about communicating technical, esoteric concepts to a broad audience in a way that resonates with them? So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. As Gio and Angie said, I love the activity that we're seeing in the chat. I saw a couple of hello from New Yorks. I am based in New York, so looking forward to some follow-ups out of this and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you both so much.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Thanks for being here. And so let's jump into the discussion. So just to kick it off here, the prospect of presenting to the board and influencing them and trying to get them to support the job you're trying to do has a lot of challenges with it. And there are a bunch of surveys that have explained this and talked about it, including this one by FTI in partnership with Ethico. So what are some findings from that last round of survey that, again, guys, we're renewing this survey now. So hit the button in the console and join our survey if you haven't yet. But Angie and Evan, what are some of the concepts from that survey, and what are the things that you see as being kind of top of mind for this topic?
So we did our survey the first time. It's called Compliance Leadership Redefined. And we did it for the first time at about this time in 2022 and released the findings in early 2023. And there were many good insights that came from the survey on a lot of different topics. But when it comes to the board, what we found was that many of you feel that you don't have enough access to, you don't have enough input to, and you don't have enough influence with the board. Yet the board's interest in compliance issues and ROI of compliance programs is increasing. So we're going to be very interested to see, what the survey says this time around, to see if some of these things have changed. But to get a little more specific in terms of what we heard last time, 51% of our respondents said that they do not have significant input into providing strategic direction to the executive team or the board on compliance topics. 41% said that leadership puts pressure on them to downplay ethics and compliance risks when they're presenting to the board, which is a little concerning. And only 34% really strongly agreed that they've got enough time with upper management or the board to talk about compliance matters. So that's something that we hope we're going to see change in the next survey. And hopefully some of the things that we talk about today can help you improve those numbers some. Evan has done a parallel study of chief information officers, and he can talk a little bit about what that one showed.
Yeah, absolutely. And We called it CISO Redefined. So you'll note the whole redefined brand thing from FTI. We like it because that's what we're constantly trying to do is reinvent ourselves. So CISO, for those who don't know, that stands for Chief Information Security Officer. And we were looking at a lot of the same things that Angie and her team were looking at through the compliance lens, which was we've heard anecdotally in the field from our clients, from matters we've worked on, that there's some kind of gap between the Chief Information Security Officer and their board, despite the fact that most publicly traded companies are now reporting to the audit committee on a quarterly basis, and with the executive team. And so we started 2 years ago by surveying the CISO population to try to identify what challenges they felt they were facing. And then this past year, we surveyed the C-suite and to see, well, what's their perspective on how this is going. And there were so many parallels to what Angie said. We saw CISO saying they felt pressure to make things sound better than they are. We saw CISO saying they don't think that what they're saying is resonating with their boards and the executive committees, and identifying specific functions that they struggle to communicate key topics to. They felt underprepared to present technical concepts to a more layperson type of audience when it comes to security. And so off the back of that, we realized that there may be an opportunity to actually get into the trenches with some of these folks and train them in the same way that traditional comms people have focused on training CEOs and CFOs for earnings calls. How do we translate some of these concepts and develop messages that will resonate with the target audience? And so that's where we created a program called Secure Your Seat, which is in its initial stages tailored for that CISO who wants to feel confident in that seat at the C-suite table and that seat at the board level. And we've really learned a lot of practical tips, tricks, and things that seem fairly straightforward, but really it's not a wholesale adjustment of how these presentations are being done. It's just how do you effectively translate what's in your head to an audience in a way that will get them to understand the risk tolerance of the organization, get the investment that you need. And again, I keep going back to this, position that leader as someone who's not just thinking about risk, but is also enabling the success of the business. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that today and share some of the learnings we've seen from that CISO community, because I really think there are so many parallels to the compliance function. Ooh. Gio, I think we've lost your audio.
Lost Gio's audio. Maybe I can.
Is this working?
There you go.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you, Chase. You know what? Chase is on the case. He's got me. See, Angie, I told you. You don't got to worry about it. I'll mess up for all of us. Thanks for bearing with me, guys. So listen, if you're in the episode today, you probably care about this and you know this is something we could be better at. So let's talk about why this matters. So one thing to give you a little bit of hope about this is there is this concept embedded in this board advocacy piece that is what I like to call asymmetric risk. And this is really something that you deal with across your job all the time. There's a small thing that can have a huge impact, right? You might have 1 or 2 reports come in through your case management system each year that are really where a ton of the risk is. You might have 1 or 2 items or vendors in your risk assessment that are really where so much of your risk is. And this board thing is one of those things that can be kind of deceptive because it's probably a relatively small portion of your time. You're probably not spending 20, 30, 40% of your time in board meetings. It's probably something that you have a small amount of time and influence on, but also getting it right can make such a big impact. So when this isn't done well, then it can impair the board and executives' perception of chief compliance officers and the compliance function that ends up limiting your program's effectiveness. Obviously, this is closely tied to the amount of budget that you can secure if you want to continue down this path of continuous improvement to improve the effectiveness of your compliance program. And also, if you're not engaging at the board and executive level well, then it's going to be harder and harder for you to build those effective partnerships that are really going to make managing your risk even more difficult, right? This is tied into that middle manager toolkit idea of if you can get someone else who's the chief revenue officer or the COO or someone on the board to be backing what you're doing in compliance, it's going to be a lot easier to get the people who report in their downline up to them to also become advocates and partners in your program. So the bottom line is that we believe, and we're here to help you figure out how chief compliance officers and other leaders in the compliance and ethics function can improve your standing with executives and the board members by enhancing your communication skills and your relationships. And Evan, you were kind of talking about this earlier, that like when you first come into a compliance role, communication skills are relevant to everything, but it's not really that big of an impact. You're in more of a technical role. And, you know, as you get more successful, then it becomes more and more important. So, let's talk about what some of the challenges that executives and board members may feel when they hear from compliance officers. I think there's a great way to start this conversation, because let's start with that empathetic thing that we all try to be great at as compliance leaders, of like, who's on the other side of the table? Who are we trying to land this message to? And Evan, talk to us a little bit about what is challenging to them, because I think that that's going to lead us on a good path to figuring out how we can land these messages better.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few sort of consistent challenges that I see and that we see. And probably the biggest headline, which likely will not shock anyone, but it is the reality, is presentations or discussions are too technical. And there's always a line to be drawn, because you want to demonstrate competency and understanding with highly technical concepts, but not in a way that makes your audience feel like you're speaking a totally different language. So when I think about this through the security lens, board members, executives don't know, nor do they care, what NIST 2.0 or ISO 2000 compliant is. You have to figure out a way to translate, what does that actually mean? Like if I'm sitting here and I'm trying to assess risk across my organization, what are these technical concepts actually mean for us? What do they mean for our risk tolerance? What do they mean for our risk profile? And it doesn't have to feel like a dumbing down exercise. It's just taking a step beyond the acronym, the regulation, the particular law in a particular geography, to explain it in straightforward English. So that's really one. The second, which is overcomplicates things even more, is just time. Gio, you referenced this. Even for the chief information security officers who are having these quarterly meetings with their boards, you're looking at 15 minutes max. And so you really have to think about, like, how do I make this high impact? How do I strip away what's not necessary for my presentation and understand what are the 5-6 things I want people walking out of that board meeting to think about? Similarly, no headline and no context. If particularly, because for anyone here who's been in a board meeting, you're submitting all your content ahead of time. And so if you are buried in slides with graphs and charts and red, yellow, green, and all the rest of it, you're not going to get people to really understand the core concepts that you want them to grasp looking at your material. And then you're trying to play defense, explaining concepts that people don't understand. Not having a call to action. And so a sort of, so what? Now, if there's a little bit more help on that front on the security side, just because of, again, for publicly traded companies, new SEC regulations has kind of put a little bit of the onus on the board. But even so, what are you asking for? What do you need to reduce that risk profile, move the maturity of the organization forward? That is really important, so that it's not just an information dump, but it's an information sharing session that leads to outcomes that you think are going to be beneficial for your organization. And then finally, and this is the hardest one, and I've had so many conversations with security leaders, which is how to do some sort of analysis on return on investment. And doing that in both the defensive, but also, I keep going back to this term, business enablement side. I was meeting with a chief information security officer that we're putting through our training program, and he said to me, Evan, I feel like I'm pretty good on the sort of protective, defensive side. And again, there are parallels to compliance here where, okay, I feel like I've helped them understand what the risks are, but how do I explain to my executive team and my board that giving me the budget I'm looking for actually has upside for the business? That's challenging, but defining a repeatable sort of ROI framework so that people don't think they're throwing money down a black hole they don't understand, but are seeing the net benefits of it, is really, really important. So those are some of the most consistent challenges I see again and again and again when having conversations in the security realm that I think really just have a ton of parallels to the compliance world as well.
Thanks so much, Evan. Angie, I want to give you a chance to comment on that. But first, I'd like to encourage the audience here. We went through 5 or 6 things there, and I'd like to hear from you which of these seem most challenging to you or are like the biggest kind of news headline to you. We talked about the presentation being too technical, your kind of the time being too short or you taking too long, missing a headline, missing context, missing a call to action, or missing analysis on ROI. I'd love you guys to jump in while I give you a second to react, Angie. Throw in the chat which of those you feel like you need to level up the most on. Any comments on those, Angie? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Evan is absolutely right that, we hear a lot of the same things from the compliance officers that we work with and others who are receiving their information. For those of us who are professional communicators, these things are kind of basic, but when your profession is something else and communications is just something that you need to be good at in your job, these things aren't so obvious. So we're going to get into some of these things in some more depth and help give you some tips to make them a lot easier and improve your success there. And we're going to talk quite a bit at the end too about ROI and how you might be able to look at that.
Awesome. Thanks, Angie. Yeah, I would just encourage everyone as we get into this, we want you to be encouraged by this, right? Like those are some pretty kind of harsh survey results from that survey released in 2023 about 50% of people say that they're, detractors. Their board are detractors of the compliance program. And, 40+% of people say that leaders are trying to get them to minimize how they talk about these risks. There are definitely some challenges here, but also who's going to be the change we want to see in the world? It's going to be you. It's going to be us. And there are things that you can do to change this. And I think, getting back to that asymmetric risk, there's a small amount of time that has a big impact. If you can make that small amount of time a little bit better by putting the bottom line up front and giving that context and giving that headline, or by having a clear call to action, or by condensing your story or any of those things, just a few of those small changes can start bending the curve on this and making it a lot better. And I would just encourage us all to kind of get out of our head and to think about, try to imagine where these board members are. Because listen, if your board members are just like extreme narcissists and they're like absolute criminals, then you presenting better is not going to like get them to back your compliance program. But hopefully a few of us have just like normal people on a board who just need some better advocacy and better communication. And there's a lot that we can do to improve this. And I think it starts with understanding your audience and understanding what it's like for them to get that 15-minute snippet in the context of all this other stuff when they haven't, they're not CCEP certified and they don't read regulations all the time and all of that stuff. If you understand where they're at, then it'll probably make it a little bit easier for us to engage with them. So thanks for jumping in the chat and sharing some things that you want to level up on most. We're going to go deeper into this and give you some really applicable things that you can apply to your next board or executive meeting. So let's jump into tips for improving your communications and relationships. How does a compliance officer raise their credibility and influence through better communication? We spend so much time honing our craft and building our mind and building our understanding. How can we make this impact through better communication and influence with more credibility, Evan?
Sure. So when I think about this topic, and I think I just saw one of them in the chat, and Gio, you presaged this a little bit. I think about 4 key things. First, your audience, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second here. Second, your key messages in your Q&A. Third, the presentation itself, what the content is and how you deliver it. And fourth, and one that I think is actually really oftentimes overlooked by the folks I'm working with, is your coalition, your supporters, who's going to be both in that meeting, after that meeting, the sidebar conversations that are going to be had, who's going to be your co-advocate. So let me just start with your audience. I think this applies to any form of communications, whether it's presenting to an executive team, presenting to a board, managing a crisis. It really doesn't matter. Know your audience is the key rule of effective communications. Putting yourselves in the shoes of the person that is hearing you speak or reading your presentation and understanding what are their motivations, what is their experience with the topic you're speaking about, What's their point of view on what you're trying to present? And how do they like to receive their information? So some of this can take a little bit of homework, right? You do a little research on your board or your executive team. Understand what other organizations have they been part of. Have those organizations faced compliance issues? If so, their experience might be a little different than somebody else. I think back to a presentation that I was helping a security leader give to a board after an incident occurred. And I knew that one of the members of that board was the chief executive officer of a company that had been through a major security incident in the last couple of years. So you're going to have to tailor your Q&A and your reactive messaging because that's someone who's going to know what to ask. Same thing goes for compliance. And so really understanding not just what does a board want, but what does your board want? What is their experience and how are they looking at this topic? That to me is the first way to set yourself up for success, and everything really follows that. So I know the second was key messages and Q&A. Angie, I'd love to turn it over to you here to jump in on this one.
Yeah, key messages, so important. Nick made a comment in the chat a minute or two ago about 15 to 30 second commercials and how persuasive they can be. That's because they're relevant and they've got a message and it comes through loud and clear. And that takes some preparation, takes a little work. It's something we do in communications all the time, and it's something that you can do in preparation for just about any meeting or conversation you're going to, but especially important, for something as critical as a board presentation. So there's some very easy things you can do here. When you think about your key messages, think about what are the 3 things that you want your audience to remember if they don't remember anything else you said. You need to really think about what those are. Write them out. Get them in the words that you are confident that you want to use, that really get your point across, and get it across, efficiently and clearly. And make sure that that's what comes through loud and clear throughout your 15 minutes. And what if your time gets cut? What if your 15 minutes ends up being 5? That's happened to all of us. And I know it's happened to you. So if that happens, you already know walking in, these are the 3 things I need to say. If I don't get to say anything else, I need to make sure these 3 or 4 or 5, but no more than 5 things get across to this group. So write those down, make sure that you're very clear on them and can, easily share them. And so, what does that mean? What makes a strong key message? First of all, make sure you emphasize the why. Always the why. Why are we doing this? Why is this necessary for the business? How is it going to impact the business? What will be, positive about it? And then the how. How are we going to approach this? Not necessarily in a lot of tactical detail, but from a strategic point of view, how are we going to approach this thing that we need to accomplish? And then for this particular audience, be sure to talk about what are we going to get out of it? What's the return that we can expect? And make sure to always that you connect your plans, your program to the larger needs of the business strategy. If you are not connecting what you're doing to the business strategy, then there's not really a need for you to be doing it. And that's how the board will certainly see it. It's how the executive team will see it. So make sure that, everything that you're doing, everything that you might be asking for something for, you can connect it back to the business strategy and how we're going to succeed, as a company. And finally, I think as Evan already said, make sure you replace that technical jargon with layperson language that anybody can understand and anybody can repeat. And, when you start hearing people repeat back to you what you've said, you'll know that you got those key messages through.
Awesome. Oh, go ahead, Angie. Sorry.
Yeah, one other thing in there that's also really critical, and that's your Q&A prep. We would never, ever go into an important conversation or an important announcement or presentation without spending a little time first anticipating what are the questions I'm going to get and, what are the tough questions I'm going to get, and really thinking through your responses ahead of time and making sure that you're repeating some of those key messages in your responses. And this is especially important, if you have an executive session with the board, because that's where you're probably going to get the toughest questions and have the most candid conversations. So by really just spending, a little bit of time, it doesn't actually take that much time, but spending a little bit of time in advance to make sure that you thought through all that, you're going to feel a lot more prepared and a lot more confident going into those conversations, even if your time gets cut.
Cool. Thank you, Angie. There have been a couple comments in the chat that I want to make sure that we address here around the distinct nature and need for how you engage a board of directors versus a management team. To me, it seems like a lot of these things are somewhat universal for presenting to senior leaders, but it's absolutely a great point that you're going to have different level of depth in prodding and maybe time with your executive team than you are with just the board of directors in, a 5 or 15-minute presentation each quarter. So Evan, let's kind of go back to the points that you talked about a couple minutes ago, and then we can go through some of the things that Angie brought up. But as you think about those in the context of a board presentation versus an executive team presentation, or the, increased likely follow-up in time you're going to have with an exec team, how might those differ, or how might you apply those differently?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've already seen some great thoughts in the chat about the distinction between these two. The way I think about the difference, there are a lot of universal parallels about how to up your presentation skills, your comm skills, but the board meetings are very much moments in time, right? They are brief, distinct, and one of the things that's really important, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later, is repeatable frameworks where you are showing this is where we were last quarter or last beginning of the year or the last half of the year. Here's the progress we've made, and they want to see that sort of stepwise forward momentum type of content. And it's not the place where you're going to be leaning as much on personal relationships. You may be with your fellow executives who are around the table, but it's not as likely that someone who's in compliance, or in my world in information security, is going to have that friendly, we went to a ball game 2 weeks ago type of relationship with the board member. The board member likely has another full-time job somewhere else. And so those are very much those bite-sized, it looks familiar, it feels familiar, it fits with the rest of the presentation, chances for you to demonstrate the progress you are making against a given framework. Executive presentations, if it's a formal set presentation, follow a lot of those same concepts, but what you have is the informal access that you have to that group, to your peer set in that executive leadership team. And I saw some really good ideas in the chat here that I would just emphasize, which is, don't have that be the only time you're having conversations with that executive team. Pop into someone's office for 5 minutes, give them a little preview of one of the concepts you want to talk about. Introduce that concept, Gio, that you were talking about of asymmetric risk and what does that really mean. Give them a little information as, what do you do every day? If they're not an executive that grew up joined at the hip with a compliance function, they might not have any idea what a day in your life looks like. Build more of that personal brand, and that will really set you up for success. It'll build allies in that executive room. And candidly, that will eventually translate to those board presentations, because you will have a coalition of people who are there to help and support you and say, yep, I'm standing behind my compliance officers ask for additional budget or the framework they're putting in front of you. So just don't underestimate the importance of personal relationships to the extent you can build them. I think security and compliance share a parallel where if the effort isn't put into that relationship building and that coalition building, they can very quickly get translated into, that's Chicken Little who sits in the corner and tells us the sky is falling every 5 minutes. And I've seen that in the security world over and over. Someone raises a risk and they say, oh, but Scott always talks about that, and nothing ever happens. But when you build that personal relationship with people, they'll sit up and listen when you have something serious to talk about. So that, I think, is where you've got more opportunity to flex into who you are as a person and build relationships with those executives so that they know when you say, hey, I've got something serious to talk about, that it's serious.
That's great, Evan. Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, as I think about this distinction, and it's really important, so I'm glad we're digging in on it. There is more chance for your executive team to have follow-up or to dig in and ask probing questions and things like that. And I'd encourage us all to use that for the strength that it can be. And if you know that you're going to be able to talk to them in a day or a week or a month afterward and follow up with them, then use that opportunity for that engagement and use, whether like Evan was talking about, you stop by their office and just say, hey, I want to let you know this thing is going well. And, I'm looking forward to updating you at the monthly meeting. Or, even if you have more than 15 minutes at that exec meeting, then I encourage you to, like Angie was talking about, and I want to hear more from you in a minute, Angie, but like prepare your presentation and think about how you want that to go, right? It can start with understanding who your audience is and being empathetic for them and using some of these tips for communication. But also, I think a great sign that you're engaging well and presenting well is when people are asking follow-up questions. And in order to do that, you need to not dump all the information on them so that they get bored, but you got to give them a little bit of a preview. And then they say, wait, what did you mean about that? And you say, oh, great. Well, let's go to the next slide, or let's go to the appendix because I'm also ready to talk about that, and let them dig in on the things that they want to dig in on, and set like a few pieces, set a few pieces of pie out for them. Everyone loves a good pie. See which one they want. And they're probably not going to want to like do your whole job for you and dig in on everything that you're talking about, but give them some things that you think might be a hook for them to jump in on, and then be ready to have that discussion. And when that happens, if you're prepared for it and that's how you wanted the conversation to go, then you start getting more excited and you start saying, great, I'm so glad you asked. You know what? I nerd out on this stuff all the time. I'm ready to talk about that topic with a bottom line up front, with a conclusion and context and all of that, and have that additional part of your conversation and use that in your executive discussions where you have some more time for in the meeting follow-up or after the meeting to try to build that story with them where they say, hey, this person told me about this. I was interested, not in everything, but a little bit of it. They were prepared for that. They gave me some follow-up. This is really somebody that I vibe with. This is someone I can trust. This is someone who's credible. This is someone who is prepared and reliable. And they communicate in a way that makes sense to me. If you can just imagine making that a little bit of that type of impression with someone on your executive team and kind of build that up over time, then you're going to see this whole thing change. Your whole relationship with your executive team probably isn't going to change in one 15-minute presentation where you were super prepared. You have to build this over time like so many other things, but you can absolutely transform it. So Angie, tell us a little bit about your perspective on some of those things you were talking about, how that might differ applying that in an executive context different from the board context we were kind of focused on.
Yeah, there's one word that comes to mind for me when I think about that, and it's relevance. Think about what's relevant to the board versus what's relevant to the executive team. And, the board's job is to make sure that the company can meet its commitments and deliver on its business strategy. The executive team's job is to, of course, make sure the company can deliver on the strategy that it develops, but it's also the exec team's job to execute against that strategy. So you're going to be into more of the tactical and more of the detail. And as everyone has said here, you're going to be talking to the executive team probably more often, both formally and informally. Board is not so often, and they're much more interested in high level, in trends, in what's coming up next, and what are the risks that are emerging, how are we going to deal with those things. So relevance to your audience, I think, is the big difference there.
That's awesome. Thanks for that, Angie. And it reminds me of this great comment from Francisco who said, how do you know what your board or exec team wants to hear from you? And not just guess, but how do you know? And, I think we talked a little bit earlier about looking at their backgrounds. You can kind of get to understand them or get to know them and stuff. How else do you think that, maybe starting with Angie, how can we target that relevance? Because, I think that we can conceive of these people live a different life from us and they don't know as much about, tactical compliance and stuff like that. But what are some other ways that we can target that relevance and understand kind of who we're talking to and what matters most to them?
Well, certainly those relationships, if you have built up relationships with one or more board members where you have an opportunity to ask, am I hitting the target in terms of what you need to know from me? Those kinds of conversations built on trust and credibility, I think, are one way to do it. Another really simple way might be if you have access to the board minutes. What are they asking about? And what have they asked about in the past? What do they care about? And take a look at that. Talk to other of your peers on the executive team who have to present to the board. What kind of questions are you getting? What level of detail are they looking for from you? Where do you get pushed back? There are historical places, I think, where you can look to see what they've been interested in, but also, leverage those relationships that you are building or have already built.
Thanks, Angie. Anything to add on that, Evan, about how we can, get that context and understand our audience better?
I would just double down on something that Angie said, and it also speaks to the walk between the executive leadership presentations and the board presentations, is understand who's talking to that board all the time. General counsel, CFO, it doesn't have to be the chief executive. And just get tell me what it's really like in there, or what do they really enjoy hearing? What content resonates with them? I remember, speaking for myself, I was presenting to the board of a company that I had been working for some time. And one of the members of the legal team, who was often in that room, pulled me aside 2 days beforehand and said, "Hey, by the way, these are the 3 questions you're probably going to get. And this is the type of thing they like. They like crisp, they like short, they like sound bites." Man, if I hadn't gotten that ahead of time, I might have completely put my foot in my mouth in that meeting. Build the relationship so someone wants to help you, and you don't even necessarily have to go knock on the general counsel's door and say, "Hey, do you have 20 minutes to talk about what our board likes?" But they pull you aside ahead of time and say, "Let me just give you 3 tips before we walk into this meeting." That stuff really is built on those relationships that you can invest in at the upfront, at the executive level, so that you feel confident walking into that boardroom.
That's awesome.
And just to build on that point, if I could, as you're building your relationships with your peers on the executive team, you're going to want to be aligning with some of those people, especially the people who've got risk management as part of their job in some definition, because you don't want to go in there saying different things, in your separate presentations. You want to make sure that you're aligned. So an even better reason to have them want to help you, because you're helping them too.
That's awesome. Thanks for that, Angie. Yeah, I mean, a bunch, I just want to recognize that a bunch of these things that we're talking about, they take some extra time and effort. So we got to be honest about that, right? You can't just kind of do stream of consciousness and type 300 words per slide and just say, "Hey, this is what I'm doing. This is what I got." All of these things take some time, but getting, back to that asymmetric risk concept, it's worth you spending 5 minutes with each of 3 people who are going to be in that meeting and just say, "Hey, if you got a quick minute, 5 minutes, tell me about this," right? Ask them, what are you presenting on that day? What's on your docket? Okay, let me try to tie in some of that, because then we can be unified. Hey, I love the concept of asking for feedback, right? And say, "Hey, you know what? This is very powerful when you're vulnerable, especially to these people who care a lot about the business, are interested in the mission, and they in some part of their job, they don't want your job to be a failure, right? They don't want everything wrecked by a compliance or regulatory risk." And be transparent with them and say, "Hey, listen, you know what? I'm trying to get better at my presentation skills. I was on the Ethicsverse the other day and realized I have some gaps. Tell me a little bit, how should I prepare for this, right? What is this team like, or whatever?" Ask for that and do a little recon beforehand. And just a little bit of that can give you some context. And if nothing else, it can give you a little confidence going into it and saying, "Hey, I kind of know the room that I'm walking into," and it can really make a big difference. So invest some time into that, which I don't say easily, because we're all really busy and we got a lot of stuff going on, but invest a little time into that and it's going to be worth it for you. So Evan, let's jump back into the presentation. Let's talk about the ways that we tell our story, and the way we put this together, and how that can help us.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gio, you framed it up perfectly, because it is, no matter what topic you're talking about, no matter how technical or esoteric it is, starting from the beginning of, I'm going in to tell a story, and putting yourself in a storyteller's mindset that follows the traditional arc of a story helps engage people. I saw someone in the chat say, what do you do if you see all your board members on your phone? Well, that's where you kind of strayed away from that concept, and you're just doing a punch list. In terms of presentation skills, so I've worked with people who have disparate styles. What I would say is be yourself and lean into your strengths. So anybody who's watching this right now can see that I talk with my hands. And if I'm going into a formal presentation, I'm still going to do the same thing, because trying to be someone you're not is going to set you up to look robotic, pre-programmed, etc. I'd also say, to the extent you can find the time, because as Gio said, I know everybody on this is very busy, practice. Some of the best historical off-the-cuff speakers, it will not shock anyone to learn, are not speaking off the cuff. And they practiced how to look like they're speaking off the cuff. And so I was dealing with a chief information security officer who's not a natural public speaker, who gets really nervous. He said, what do I do when I start feeling those nerves? I said, practice in front of a mirror. Have a member of your team interrogate your presentation before you go in there. Someone you're really comfortable with, even someone who might be a little junior to you, and ask them to ask you the hard questions so that you just feel that degree of confidence because you put the work in. In terms of the presentation itself, I'd just say a couple of things. As I mentioned earlier, when you're talking about a board presentation, but very often executive presentation too, you're going to be sending your slides or whatever you're presenting ahead of time. So, a lot of people try to fit everything they can onto a slide and say, well, when I get into the room, I'll just say the 3 most important things, and that's how I'll bridge the delta between the written content and the verbal content. The problem is if you're giving people an eye chart ahead of time, they're already going to be zoned out by the time you walk in that room because they tried to do the pre-read and felt like it just went completely over their heads. So try to be as concise with your written material and punchy as you are with your spoken material. The other thing I'd say as it relates to that, and this probably will not be a surprise to anyone, figure out a way to use your talk track to bring the punchy concepts in your slides to life. Nobody wants to watch someone sit there and read words on a slide. They've already read that. So you can take the slide, which is the what, and then you're there to describe the so what, and that gap between the two. You bring that content to life through your presentation. And then again, we've talked about this before, but when you're talking about KPIs or ROI, while you're there to provide the color in the presentation, try to present it on your slide content or your PDF or whatever you're using as something that a lay person in your field, not saying that anyone on a board or an executive team just wandered in off the street, but someone who's not in your field could understand in a way that resonates with them. One thing that I found to be really, really helpful is if you've got a slide that's talking about KPI or ROI, go to another function, find a friend, again, going back to relationships, give them the slide, don't explain it, and say, does this make sense to you? Like, can you get what I'm getting at here? And if they don't, take another pass at it. So I think those are things that can really make the presentation itself really effective. And if there's certain topics that you're passionate about, lean into that, right? If there's a part of the business, irrespective of what your job is, that really motivates you or drives you, touching on that and connecting your function to the business strategy, you have to do that quickly because you may only have a few minutes, but where you're starting to position yourself as a business leader and not just a risk manager, both in security and compliance, it can change the perception of the board. Just to hear you say a couple of minutes of, this is how what I'm doing relates to this key initiative that we're doing, or this investment we're making in this new market, or this new product, or this new service offering. That can really alter the perception of this is not just somebody who comes to give me the same bland presentation, but I really think Gio, as my head of compliance, is invested in the business beyond his sphere. So those are just a few things that I've seen really sort of turn the tide of those presentations and really make them resonate with board members and, again, with executive teams as well.
Cool. Thanks so much, Evan. So as we got a little bit less than 15 minutes in, I think there's a lot that we could talk about, including building your coalition and building those relationships. But I want to make sure we get to this concept of ROI. There's a lot of things that we talk about, our tactics and our strategy and giving context to it. And what I've found in my time in this community is that discussion of ROI sometimes eludes us. And while you probably don't want to and can't spend 80% of your time talking about the numbers, being able to make a valid claim that's backed up by evidence and thoughtfulness about how this is not just something that I care about, but this is something that is going to give a return to the business on the investment that it's going to cost in time or money or whatever it is critical to be in your presentation somewhere. So Angie, maybe tell us a little bit about how you think about that and how we can fill some of those gaps, especially as we're talking to the executive team.
Yeah, no, this is not an easy topic, but it's something we absolutely have to be thinking about. And in communications, where Evan and I live, it's just as difficult. It's just one of those things that is a little more difficult to connect directly to a business result, but that doesn't mean that you can't do it. So let's talk a little bit about that. As I'm sure you all know, most of your board members are going to be fairly data-driven type people. And ROI is going to be something that's always going to be on their mind. And the old saying that you're not in an orange jumpsuit is not quite enough anymore to justify your existence. They're thinking in terms of revenue generation or cost avoidance, and in your case, they're also thinking in terms of risk management and ensuring that we know what the next risk is and that we're addressing it. We did find in our last survey that only 22% of chief compliance officers were currently using ROI to demonstrate the value of their programs, and we certainly hope we're going to see that number go up in the current survey. But let's talk for a minute about so what can you measure? What can you measure to show ROI? And we like to think of measurement in three categories, and we call them output, impact, and outcome. And the first bucket is output. And these are really activities that you can count. The work you're doing where you can count up a quantitative number. So things like, how many trainings did we offer? What were the completion rates? How many investigations have we completed? How many calls into the hotline? How many communications were issued around compliance? All of these kinds of things that you can count. Now, these are not what you want to put in front of your board. Because this does not tell them the story that they need to understand from you. They are things you're going to be counting, but that's not your full story. The next two buckets, impact and outcome, are much more interesting to them. So the impact bucket is about the behaviors and the attitudes that you can observe. This is much more qualitative measurement. It takes a little more work, but it is not that hard to do. And that category includes things like your employees' understanding of risk areas, policies, procedures, their confidence in reporting compliance concerns, whether or not they view compliance culture as a competitive advantage to the business, whether or not your leaders are actively communicating and advocating for ethics and compliance, and whether or not compliance discussions are being held in the performance management cycle. All of these things are more qualitative, but more impactful because these are behaviors and you need to see behavior change. And then the next bucket is about business results. What is the outcome of all of this work that we've done? And these are things that are all being measured anyway by companies, things like employee retention, employee engagement, the caliber of the talent that you're attracting and keeping, your corporate reputation, your brand loyalty, profitability, all of these things that are measured by the business. You have to be able to connect the dots to from the work that you're doing. And I thought it was really interesting at SCC a few weeks ago, Nicole Argenteri talked about expecting to see appropriate access to relevant data sources from across the organization. And, a lot of these measurements are done by other functions, and you're going to need, some access to those too. So those are some things to think about in terms of what you measure. And this is also where your relationships building is going to pay off when you need to ask for some of the data that's owned by some other department. It's certainly not unusual to see people, not wanting to share their data, but that doesn't make it the right thing to do. And one other really important, valuable thing that you can do in terms of a measurement is to measure your compliance culture. And that is not as hard as it sounds. It sounds very squishy, but it can be made a lot more concrete with the right approach to measuring compliance culture. It can also give you a benchmark from which to measure your progress. And that is a large and impactful KPI that you can put in front of your board and show that, we have taken the time to really dig deep into our compliance culture and all that entails. We know where it stands. We've got a benchmark score. We know where the vulnerable areas are that we need to work on. And then when you measure the next time, you're going to be able to show progress. That's important to your board. It can also be important to an enforcement agency if you happen to be dealing with one of those. So that's another way to measure ROI on a larger scale and something that can serve you well over time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Angie. Evan, I want to get your perspective on this because I think the CISO role has some of these, similar challenges of like, how do you quantify the thing that I think I prevented or whatever? But I would just encourage everyone, there are a bunch of things embedded in what Angie was going through that I think can give you a lot of freedom to illustrate the effectiveness of your program without having this thing that I think prevents us sometimes from even engaging in this of like, I don't know exactly how many dollars that's worth, or I don't know exactly how to have a numerator and a denominator that both explain with high confidence exactly how much money I made for the company. And you don't have to start there. If you start there, you'll never get there. But Angie, you talked to us about activities you can count, behaviors and attitudes you can observe, and then business results you can impact. So if nothing else, at least start by saying, hey, you know what? Here's how this metric changed. I'm watching this all the time and this went up 20% or whatever. Start quantifying some things because there are going to be some quants in the room that really want to see some numbers. And, there's some personalities that if you can't quantify it, then it doesn't exist. If you can't put it in a spreadsheet, then it's not in the world. And have some of those things. Show some of your change in your metrics. Show some of the things that you think are impacted by your metrics. And then you can start building on that next time and saying, okay, well, you know what? We spend this much on our speak up culture and our case management and our hotline. And last year we were getting this many reports and now we're getting this many reports. Well, I'm getting more out of that spend and there's an embedded ROI in that. But there are a bunch of different ways that you can quantify the impact of what you're doing and anchor somebody to this change that's not just a qualitative description. And try to give yourself a goal to step up the clarity and the quantification that you do time to time, and also realize that you can quantify qualitative things. Right? You can say, I had this many more conversations, or, this is coming up in more of our, descriptions in our risk assessments or whatever it is, but push yourself to quantify some of those things because that's one way that you can communicate across these lines to the executive team and build this story over time. Any other perspective for us, Evan, on how, the teams that you work with deal with this often difficult concept of, specifying the value that we provide?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just share a very brief story since I know we're coming up on time. Because in the security world, and maybe this will give some inspiration to folks, there's a lot of things that you can quantify: number of attacks prevented, number of blocked IP addresses, number of this, that, and the other. And so I remember I was in a conversation with the chief information security officer at a professional services firm, and he said, I think I've got the whole risk bad thing part down. They know, the board and the executive team, why it would be really bad for us to have a severe security incident, the same way that I can imagine a really aggressive enforcement action on the compliance side. What I struggle to do is to connect what I'm doing on the days that aren't bad days that is actively helping the business strategy advance. And I said, and again, this fits into that storytelling piece, which I think goes hand in hand with quantifying, but also being able to tell a story that connects to the business. I said, well, what does the business want the professionals involved to be doing every day? What do they want the senior leaders doing? Well, it's professional services. So they want them to be out meeting new clients. They want them to be talking to people about the work they do. They want to be servicing the clients they support already and generating revenue for the business. I said, okay, can they do any of that without access to the critical technology that lets them do their jobs? I said, well, no, I suppose they can't. I said, there you go. That's what you're doing on the good days, is you are enabling them to do their job effectively without being overwhelmed with worry or concern. So I would not purport to be a compliance expert, but I think there are parallels to, we've got the structure in place that will let us operate in this market in a framework that we understand is ethical and in compliance with regulations, local laws, and that will protect our professionals from having to spend all their time worried that they're doing something wrong. And so that's what security does on the technology side. And I just think there's so many parallels. those good days are the days you're helping the business do what it's supposed to be doing, because it's not worrying about or being dragged into a problem in your specific area. So every day something bad doesn't happen, you're supporting the success of the business. And that finally clicked with him, because he thought, oh, that's right. So I'm giving them the tools to do their job by keeping them safe. And so I think there really are parallels to that. So how do you tie my function supports the growth and success of the business? It's because it's enabling the rest of the people within the organization to do their jobs in an effective way.
Thanks so much for that, Evan. Go ahead, Angie. Anything you want to add to that as we wrap up?
Just one really quick thing. I saw a number of questions in the chat about, how do you measure culture, compliance culture? And I just want to emphasize that putting a couple of questions about compliance in the employee engagement survey isn't going to get you enough information. There are ways to do compliance specific culture assessments. Usually through surveys and sometimes some additional things like interviews and things like that. But you can do something that's focused on compliance culture to really learn what you need to know in order to move the needle on compliance. So, would encourage you to explore that if you're worried about that question.
Awesome. Thank you, Angie. Thank you, Evan and Angie, both of you, for joining us today. Everyone in the audience, thanks for being on the Ethicsverse today. There's a lot that we've talked about, and I just want to encourage you as you reflect on this, try, just like you should finish your presentation to the executive team with a takeaway, I encourage you to pull a takeaway out from this and figure out how you can better do something like we've talked about, better preview things with people on the executive team, build better relationships, understand what's on their radar, and how can you go meet with somebody and say, hey, what do you care about coming up into this? Do your preparation, not just with the audience, but also practice things. Share a slide with somebody and say, hey, does this make sense? This presentation today, our Ethicsverse, was really trying to give you applicable things that you can pick up. And I encourage you, pick up that pen that you got sitting in front of you, or pull out your notes app and write one thing down that you heard today that you can reference, email it to yourself, throw it in your Slack notes or whatever, and pick up something that you can change next time, because we're all going to get back to work and then go, run into the end of this week and then focus on whatever task is at hand. But these presentations, these relationships with your executive team can really transform your effectiveness and the team that you serve. So pick up something and apply it today. It's been great spending some time with you on the Ethicsverse today. Shout out to everybody recovering from the hurricanes in Western North Carolina and Florida and Tennessee. Our prayers are with you. And shout out to Nick. Thanks for jumping in the chat, Nick. Everyone, Nick is healing up. He's doing better and better and stronger every day. Keep the support and the love going for Nick. We love your work. We'll be joining you here on the Ethicsverse next week at noon Eastern on Thursday.